Okay. With that out of the way, what we're going to do today is understand the basic biomechanics of the pelvis and lower body. I have a couple of models that we'll be able to sort of visualize this on. I have a big skeleton model, also a couple of smaller pelvis and foot models. We're going to then understand how to objectively assess for limitations. This means that there's no guessing. I want you guys to be able to say, okay, this is what's going on based off of these objective tests, not just this is what potentially could be going on. We want to have as good of a picture and as clear of a picture as we can possibly get. And then we want to appreciate the contextual application of constraints, which comes in a wide variety of different shapes and forms, to bias certain biomechanical outcomes to improve those tests. Because if they're not improving on the tests, then they're not going to be improving in their movement. It's very rare to see someone improve their movement without improving on one of these objective assessments too. And then ultimately we want to use strategic exercise selection to drive an intended outcome. So this would mean, how do we load people more? How do we get them to load heavier and heavier positions to allow them to integrate this stuff into the things that they actually care about, which for a lot of us is lifting weights and exercising or running or sprinting, whatever it may be. Let's go over some basic biomechanics really quick. So I'm going to be referring to the sacrum, the innominate bones, and I will also be sprinkling in some respiration as well. So if we take a look at this pelvis model right here, there's two main roles that the sacrum can ultimately have. One is nutation, which is flexion of the sacrum bone coming forward. And then the other one is counter nutation, which leads to extension of the sacrum. So these things are associated with respiration. When you guys hear the words on the internet, expansion and compression, this is usually at least partially what they're referring to. When we have a sacrum go in one direction, the innominates, the pelvic bones, act inversely to that. And I'm going to bring out my pelvis model. I'll be stopping the slides every once in a while so you guys can get a visualization of what's going on here. Let me pin myself really quick. So we got this sacrum bone tipping back right here. This means that these bones right here are going to relatively come forward to this bone that's tipping back. You can see how this kind of happens. It's very subtle. It's very, very subtle. But if we had this bone come forward into nutation, then relative to what's going on with the sacrum bone coming forward, these bones right here rotate back. That's nutation right there, which is internal rotation of the innominate bones. And then this right here, the sacrum tipping back, would be external rotation of the innominate bones. So these things move inversely to one another. There's also something we should clear up as it relates to pelvic movement, because the pelvis is how I sort of like to look at the entire lower body. I think there's a lot of bottom down or bottom up and top down influences. I think for just learning these things and applying them in a sort of setting where it's easiest to understand, I think looking top down is very helpful for people at first. But of course, there are bottom up influences and they're very significant, but we're going to be going top down mostly today. So like I mentioned, if we're going to have this nutation occur, you're going to get that anterior rotation. And then relative to that, you're going to get the iliac, that's just, think of it as the innominate bone, rotating posteriorly. Counter nutation is the opposite. That is a relative motion. That means that these things are acting relatively to each other. That means that there's things happening within the pelvis itself. So this right here, anything like this is a relative motion. And I'm exaggerating the SI joint movement. I kind of say that with everything, just so people, I understand this does not actually move this way. It's just for illustrative purposes. An orientation of the pelvis would be this. The pelvis moving as one unit without anything else happening. Does that make sense? This is an orientation. This is relative motion. It's important to understand those two concepts before we go further. When we have these different actions at the lower body, usually up top. You can think of it as a swing dance. The femur follows the pelvis. The pelvis is the lead, the femur is the follow. So if we've got nutation and internal rotation up top at the pelvis, that's going to feed down the chain into internal rotation at the lower limb and pronation at the foot. This is good. This is what we would want under ideal circumstances. On the opposite end of that spectrum, we have external rotation, pelvic counternutation of the sacrum. That's going to lead to external rotation of the leg and supination of the feet. Usually these things go together. In gait, running, all this stuff, these things usually happen together. To visualize that, if I do this, this is internal rotation and nutation, yeah? Then these bones right here are gonna be able to rotate inwards. They pick up leverage to rotate inwards. It'd be kind of hard for these bones to rotate outwards because this bone is rotating in and then this follows. If I have external rotation, this sacrum bone tips back, then these bones can turn out into external rotation. Internal rotation as a whole, external rotation as a whole. We all on the same page so far? All right. Ultimately, though, I wish it was that easy because depending on what movement you're looking at, most things in natural human movement are alternating and reciprocating joint actions. That means that if I'm in internal rotation on one leg and I'm in a split stance, I'm probably in more relative external rotation on the other leg. If I'm in more nutation on one side, I'm probably in more counter nutation on the other, assuming I am not in a bilateral symmetrical stance activity and doing something like a back squat or a barbell deadlift. If my feet are staggered, then you're going to have this alternation. And this is walking, this is running, this is cutting, this is so many things that make us humans and have to do with locomotion. And we could study gait mechanics all day. And this is the thing when it comes to these hour-long presentations, it's like, what do I keep in? What are the things that are necessary to know? What's just nice to know in this hour? This is something that we could spend a whole month on, but ultimately just notice how you're going into internal rotation, moving out of internal rotation, depending on where you are. Generally speaking, when we are moving into the earliest phases of gait, in the first sort of 10 to 20%, we're kind of biasing ourselves towards moving into internal rotation. After we get to about 20%, we begin to move towards external rotation and then back to internal rotation. So you can think of it as this sort of nice tide like the ocean coming in and out. We're always moving to one or the other. We're not just internally rotated. We are internally rotating or externally rotating relative to the place we're starting from. So if you guys look at 20% right here of the stance phase, peak internal rotation, right? So we will begin to externally rotate from a place of internal rotation. And when we go along with that, when we go into internal rotation, we get pronation of the foot. External rotation is associated with more of the supination of the foot. Here's an important concept, and I hope you guys have seen something like this before, but this is the lower body movement arc. This is a concept. This is not a hard and fast rule. I think some people take this and think of it as if this is sort of always how it is. And I like to think of this as a guiding tool rather than sort of, this is like concrete, right? I think it helps visualize a lot of what we're about to talk about. So you can think of it like hip flexion. In early levels of hip flexion, that would be just me going down. Think about like a squat, for example. Imagine a squat position, and this is going to help you visualize it quite well. From 0 to 60-ish degrees, you're going to be biased towards sacral counternutation and an external rotation bias. This is usually associated with flexion, abduction, external rotation. All these joint actions are usually paired together, as we've seen before. From 60 to about 110-ish degrees, and again, this varies depending on the individual, but this is the general range, you're going to see more of a transition towards nutation and internal rotation. This means that the innominate bones are going to go into extension, adduction, internal rotation. Our foot is going to be biased towards more dorsiflexion and pronation. And then in the deepest level of hip flexion, you're going to see a recounter nutation, a movement back towards external rotation, and then you're going to see these joint actions come back. So we can pick a level of hip flexion and we can bias that, and we can bias a certain biomechanical position. So for example, if I wanted to go after internal rotation, maybe I would probably want to spend more time in this range. External rotation, maybe one of these two. We can also apply this to why a lot of things and compensations build up. Why is it that someone's knees might cave in at the hardest point of a squat? That would be around 90 degrees of hip flexion. Maybe they're missing internal rotation at their pelvis and they're trying to pick it up by using one joint lower, the path of least resistance, which would be their knees. Another example would be, why is it that people can maybe do a butt wink in a squat and squat deeper, but it's clear that their pelvis rolls underneath them? What that could be is they can't recounter nutate. So they're stuck here, their pelvis is forward, and the only way they can find that sacrum tipping back is to roll their hips underneath them. And that allows them to get deeper, but that's not getting this. It's just orientation, rolling under. Okay. Any questions on that before we go forward? You can put them in the chat. Let's see if there's anything there. How do I like to define the term biomechanics? I think you could take that a lot of different ways. For me, it's, to put it simply, I think it's just biomechanics is the understanding of how joints, how the human body works in literally a mechanical manner. It's the way that we use levers, physics integrated with movement and joints. That's how I think of biomechanics. And then the muscular position is secondary to that. Difference between men and women, yes, men tend to have a bias towards more of a internally rotated, nutated position. Usually women tend to have those wider hips, right? That's more of an external rotation bias, because wider hips, they're looking at the top. They're looking at this, they're not looking at that. So usually, and that's not always the case. And Inja asks, external rotation bias, 110 to 120 degrees or 120 to 180? It's 110 to 120 because the human body only really has 120 degrees of genuine hip flexion. Shoulder flexion is a different story. So if that knee caving occurs, then we need to seek internal rotation at the pelvis. Potentially, yes, because if I just collapse my knees in at the hardest point of a squat, look at what that's going to allow me to do. Instead of keeping my knees in line with my toes and getting this action genuinely. They're probably missing it to some degree. All right, let's keep the ball rolling. We're going to go over some assessments now. And before we get into it, I really want to make it clear that a lot of these tests are not executed with the proper intention. A lot of people will try to pass the tests, and a lot of people will allow these compensations to occur. I'm a real stickler for looking for exactly what I'm looking for. Any deviation, the test is over, because then they're using a compensatory strategy. I'll let you guys know what these are. So the goal is not to pass the test, because we want to get a reflection of where your body is right now. And we can't do that if we're trying to shove ourselves into a range of motion we can't really get into. A small difference in just 10 degrees can give you a different interpretation of where you or a client is at. And we don't want that. So let's just make sure that we're really going slow, understanding the instructions and understanding what to look out for. The first test is hip flexion. This is testing, and again, this is a relative motion test. This is testing for external rotation and counter nutation on the active leg, and nutation and hip extension on the down leg. So if he can get to 120 degrees, That's a reflection of his ability to get to that counter nutation and external rotation. What we do not want to happen is this other leg come off of the ground. If that happens, then that means that this person has lost their hip extension on the down leg. I would call the test as soon as I see that leg lift 1 centimeter off of the ground. We also want this leg to come back perfectly in line. If that leg turns out like that, you see how you can see the ankle? That means that they're trying to bring their leg out to the side to swing it around, and they're probably rolling their pelvis on the table in some way. We want to make sure we're not doing that. So the way I would measure this would be from the table relative to this angle right here. So you could draw a straight line to here and then right up to there. If you wanted to get even more of a assessment for external rotation, you could try to actively take your hands, wrap them around your knee and pull them to your chest. And then that would be a reflection of full external rotation, counter nutation on that side. I just, for the purposes of this video and demonstration, I'm just focused on getting to 120. Honestly, that's all I've ever needed, but you can add that if you want. If they feel a hip flexor pinch as well, the test is over. It should feel pretty clean. So to recap that, if they can only get to 60 to about 110 degrees, they're kind of stuck in that internal rotation and anterior orientation. If they get to 120-ish, that means they can re-counternutate and re-access pelvic external rotation. But if they get way past that, then that's probably a reflection of this person starting in a ton of anterior pelvic tilt. And you can think of it like this. Normal standing, right? But if I'm extended and my pelvis is forward and I go to lay on the table, what's going to happen? I'm going to be starting with my hamstrings off of the ground. So I can then bring this leg back potentially even further, but relative to my starting position, I'm not actually getting 130 degrees. I'm just starting in hip flexion. So it's easier for me to get back further. That's something to look out for. It's rare to see 130 or more degrees, but if you do see it, that's usually the case of what's going on there. All right. Number 2, straight leg raise. This is what a lot of people think of hamstring length test. And that's partially what it is, but it's not entirely the case. What we're looking for here is actually just 70 degrees. We are not looking for 90. If you get to 90, it's not the end of the world. But I would start to think that maybe your hamstrings are actually a little bit too lengthened if you go past 90 degrees. Because we're using a straight leg here, and you'll see in a second, we're trying to achieve an internal rotation strategy through the screw home mechanism of the knee. If you see that knee bend at all, you have lost your screw home mechanism. If you see that other leg come off of the ground, you've lost your hip extension on the down leg. I would not call that a genuine test. So if you see that knee bend, and this is where people tend to go wrong with this test, is this knee bends 5 degrees and they still keep counting it. But we can't have that, because then that's not a reflection of getting the relative motions of the pelvis towards internal rotation. So if we can get to 70 degrees, 60, 70 degrees, then that means that we can get internal rotation on that side of the pelvis because of this right here. When we extend our knee and lock it out, that requires us to lock our femur onto our tibia, which requires the femur to go into internal rotation and the tibia to go into relative external rotation. This tightens the knee ligaments like the ACL, MCL, PCL. This is also why those ligaments tend to tear when you get hit in your knee and your knee is straight, or you take a misstep when your knee is straight, because those ligaments have no more slack to really give you. So what that looks like on the pelvic model right here is if we're on the ground and we create a rotation this way through the screw home mechanism, what we need to do to get to about 60, 70 degrees right here, we need to be able to do this right here. We need to be able to turn towards that side which if you're looking at it, what does this look like? We're going into more counter nutation on this side, nutation on this side to get to about 60, 70 degrees. Here's the thing. If they get to, let's say they can't even get to 50, which is more common than you may think. A lot of people can't even get to 50 degrees. What's that a reflection of? It's compression and concentric orientation and tightness of muscles of the posterior pelvis. And that would be the muscles that are right here. If I've got tightness deep in here, which is pulling me here, right? If these two things were to shorten, come closer together, how am I going to get the ability to do that and open that space to create internal rotation? I'm not going to. So these are your people that have a 40-degree straight leg raise because they're getting pulled right here and they can't create that dissociation. They can't create that turn to that side. And then from about 70 to 80 degrees, what they actually need to do from there is they need to be able to go relatively into external rotation from there. But I use this test as more of an internal rotation test. And I'm looking for at least 60 degrees on this. If they had a massive straight leg raise, if they had, let's say, a 100-degree straight leg raise, that's a reflection similarly to hip flexion. If I'm always here and forward with my pelvis and this hamstring is elongated because of that, when I lay down on the table, I'm probably going to be starting in that same position. And then I'm going to be able to fling this leg back, bypass a lot of the motion we need at the hips because we have such length here. That's when the hamstring starts to come into play a little bit. So that's something to look out for because this is very common with very flexible people. It can give you the impression that they have it, but they really don't. But the good thing is a lot of those people aren't going to get stuck at 50 to 60 degrees. It's going to look like they're flinging it back, not very well controlled. Their leg might move. They might roll on the table a little bit. It's pretty easy to spot usually. The next one is the squat. So this is just testing for the ability. This is just the arc that we were talking about. Can you get all the way down there? If your background's a little bit, it's not really the end of the world, but if you get a butt wink, then that's not necessarily what we want. This is Kyle right here. Notice how he is really doing a good job of not overly rounding his back. I would call this okay. What I'm looking for is a hip shift. I'm looking for the heels coming off of the floor. If their balance gets lost, then that is also an indication that he's probably compensating in some way. Other things to look out for would be the toes going outside, because then it's a lot easier to squat, right? But if we're trying to get the true lining up of the hip, femur, and foot, then we need everything to stay in line to really test. This would be a butt wink or a more hingy squat right here. Notice how if I go lower than that, come on, Connor, go lower. Then I'm going to butt wink. That's a butt wink right there. And that's because I'm someone that's biased towards internal rotation. Kyle's someone that's biased towards external rotation. So I'm a great deadlifter, but not as good of a squatter. And then he would be the inverse of that. So this is a counter nutation, external rotation test of the pelvis. And what you're usually looking for is to get those butt bones to sort of the ankle level, Achilles level. If they can't even get to 60 degrees, which is extremely rare, you're only going to see this in people that have had a ton of surgeries, very, very limited people to begin with anyway, older geriatric clientele, then they're not even able to access internal rotation or nutation in the first place. If they get to 100 degrees, can't really go much deeper than that, then they're gonna be stuck in that nutated position. They're probably a little bit extended in their pelvis and they can't recounter nutate their sacrum. But if they can get to 110 or more, then that's a good sign because that means they can probably access that recounter nutation and external rotation. So again, if I'm stuck here and I get to, let's say, 90 degrees of hip flexion, how am I going to create this? It's going to be pretty hard. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roll my pelvis underneath me. You see how that would allow me to get deeper? I think that's pretty much everything on the squat. It's a pretty easy to use test, and I think it's quite helpful. The toe touch is actually very similar. What we're looking for here is the transition from internal to external rotation. The reason why I like this test right here is because you're also going to get a feel for how extended their upper back is too. Because if what they do is just have a totally flat back, Kyle has a nice sort of like, he's a little flat, but what you're looking for is a nice even rounding of the spine right here. Because if you can achieve that, then that means that you can eccentrically orient the muscles in your back so you can get lower in your toe touch. If you were to palm the floor, what would that probably mean? It could mean that you have really long hamstrings. It could mean, if you're doing something like this right here, means that you are over compressing your rib cage in order to get down low. That is way too much of a round. We would want a nice even rounding. If the toes turn out, it's no good. And if the knees bend any more than just a little bit, it's no good. And if your heels come off the floor, that's also not a genuine test. So if you can get to your knees, and this is all generally speaking, some people have very long legs, makes it very challenging, but for the average human, if you can get to your knees and you get stuck there, you can't nutate. Because think about how much hip flexion you're going to be needing to get in. If you get to mid shin, which would be generally 90 to 100 degrees of hip flexion, then that means you can nutate, but if you get stuck there, you can't re-counter nutate. And then if it's full, you can go from ER to IR back to ER. That's just the arc model, right? So in order for us to get from here to here, we have to be able to do this to get to about mid shin. But beyond that, we have to re-access the ability to create this, because this needs to come back to allow us to round our lower back to get all the way down to touch our toes, which is okay in the context of this test. That's what we're looking for. All right. The last one I wanted to incorporate is trunk rotation. Now, this is more of an upper body test, but I think it's also an important one, because if you can't get your body to dissociate, you can't get the ability for yourself to turn to one side, then your pelvic movement is going to be dramatically compromised as a result. So I'm just holding a foam roller here, making sure nothing is moving. I'm trying to get my shoulder to the midline of my body. So right here, I'm trying to get that sort of over the foam roller a little bit. You don't want to extend, you don't want to drop, you want to make sure everything stays nice and level on this. Right there is about where we're looking. You can even get maybe a little bit further than that, but right there is adequate for many people. Let me visualize that for you guys. If we're trying to move, I need to rotate my trunk to that stance side leg. If I don't have rotation, then my hip extension is limited, and I'm not going to be able to, I'm going to be walking like a power lifter or a penguin, as we affectionately call them. So we need to make sure that we can get that trunk rotation, especially in something like running. That is just exaggerated even more. From up here, you need to create that turn, and that's what allows us to do so many things within our pelvis. So that's why I like trunk rotation when looking at the lower body as well. Okay, so that was the assessments. I'm going to answer a couple of questions, but probably not all of them, because I think we have a few. Will this be uploaded? Yeah, it will be uploaded afterwards. How does limited dorsiflexion play into the squat test? That's a good question because a lot of people think to get deep in a squat, it's very easy to look at, for example, the video of me doing it and then say that person has tight ankles, they can't get their knees to translate forward enough. But if we look at the arc model, let me pull that up really quick. Really, the most amount of dorsiflexion people need, relatively speaking, is in this zone right here. It's not right here. If you ever watch someone squat really, really deep and they do it well, their knees actually move back a little bit. And that's because you're moving more towards external rotation and plantar flexion. So to an extent, you do need dorsiflexion to squat, but I think it's often the common culprit and labeled as the culprit too often, because if you could create this motion of your pelvis and then be able to get counter nutation, then you wouldn't need a whole lot more dorsiflexion. It's helpful, sure. And that's why people see good results with it. And I don't think I want to demonize it or say it's useless, because it's absolutely not. But if we need to move from internal to external rotation of our pelvis and drop straight down, what does someone in a deep squat look like? They have a nice flat back a lot of the times, or it's not too rounded under. Usually it looks pretty smooth and comfortable. So we really need less dorsiflexion to get into the deepest portion of a squat. In terms of someone with long femurs in a squat test, that's the next question. I think you just have to you have to sort of measure it from the hip a little bit, and you have to make sure that you're just using common sense, right? If I got someone that's 6'4" and really long femurs, is that person ever going to get their butt bones to their ankles? No, but they might be able to get to mid shin. And for them, that would be a good reflection of where that person is at. And you can also use the hip flexion test to cross-reference it to make sure that you do have that external rotation. You can also use your toe touch. That's why there's a little bit of redundancy built into these tests, because it's important to know for sure where this person probably is in the most likely scenario. The first thing that we want to do is we want to restore the ability to get flexion and extension back. This means anterior and posterior orientation of the pelvis. This means sacral counter nutation and nutation on both sides. Usually I'm going to be doing a lot of work on both sides of the body with this at the same time. I might throw some unilateral stuff in there, but ultimately, if we can't create the ability to go into a position where we can do this, we can't control this, how are we ever going to be able to control that? So it's important to be able to get the orientation secured first. And the beautiful thing is, by clearing the orientation, let's say that you're forward, because this is the most common presentation. I just keep coming back to it because it's where a lot of people are. If you're here, you're biased towards a little bit of internal rotation. Yeah. But if you can come back and you can control that orientation, you suddenly pick up room to externally rotate. So by going through this step first, I believe is very important, because that allows you to open up space to have those relative motions to occur. The key principles for this are, we want to get some slight pelvic tilts. I'm not cueing a ton of low back flexion. I'm cueing a slight pelvic tilt, because it's not the same thing. A lot of people think, and I'll demonstrate this in a second, a lot of people think lumbar flexion is synonymous with the pelvic tilt, and it's not. We want to make sure that we're getting a lot of heel reference, because a lot of these people are stuck on their toes, they're stuck forward. So getting the whole foot flat, but cueing a little bit of heel is going to be important for bringing that pelvis back and restoring some motion of orientation. The muscles that are going to help create extension of the hip, the muscles that are going to help control the orientation most, is going to be the upper hamstrings, glute max, deep abs. You can make the argument some back extensors might be in there too. But again, if these people are already quite extended, then we probably want to inhibit those back extensors. And breathing, because if we can't breathe through a position, then we're not going to be able to own it. If we can't tell our nervous system this is a safe position for us to be in, then we're probably not going to want to accept that position if it's a threat. And also, through breathing, we're going to be able to create different types of pelvic orientations. So let me show you what that looks like. If I am stuck here and I do this, that's not tucking. That's low back flexion. What you want is not to lose any height in your skeleton. That is a tuck right there. If your shoulders droop, that's not what we're looking for. But if you took your hands and linked them on your lower rib cage and you were stuck right here, look at what happens. I didn't really even try to do anything, but because I'm creating engagement of my muscles of exhalation, which are my deep abs, my obliques, that's going to allow me to come out of that extension, which is quite helpful for a lot of this first step of restoring orientation. If you've got someone that has a lot of issues, or you have someone that just doesn't move well at all, a sideline 90-90 position is going to be your best bet to start off. And then notice how Kyle here is just going through some slight, gentle anterior, posterior pelvic tilts. He's just controlling it. He's feeling his heels. You guys will get these videos, by the way. I'm going to put them in a YouTube playlist and send them out in an email afterwards. So don't worry if you feel like I'm going a little fast, because you'll be able to see what's going on. They all have very in-depth explanations. This would be a very good starting position, because a sideline position is a very safe position for the human body. So what this is really doing is giving us awareness, sensory motor awareness of, and that's just a fancy way of saying muscular and positional awareness, and getting our nervous system to understand that through anterior and posterior pelvic tilts. If you do this right, you can actually restore some hip flexion. The next position I would consider using, and usually when I am laying these exercises out, this is going to be from easiest to most challenging in terms of difficulty. This position right here, I'm sure a lot of you have seen on the internet. It's a really great position for those with limited hip flexion, because I try not to push someone into a position they don't have genuinely. If I have someone that can't get their hip to 90 in that hip flexion test, why am I going to put them there? Because they're just going to compensate to get there in the first place. So this right here is a great position to breathe through it. That roller is just creating a line down the hip to the femur to the foot. And this is a very comfortable position to be in to control that anterior to posterior pelvic tilt. If you do this right, you can restore some hip extension, some flexion, and some external rotation of the pelvis as well. Another good drill, which is more unilateral in nature, is this supine cross connect. So what this is really good for is people who have really limited hip flexion, and they're going to bring it back. And you might say, well, they're bringing that leg back pretty far, aren't they? Not necessarily, because that foam roller is buying them some fake hip flexion. So if I've got some elevation right there, that's lifting him off the ground quite significantly. And what that's doing is allowing him to bring that leg back further, because he's starting in a position where he's already sort of elevated. So this right here is creating some dissociation between sides of the pelvis, but also it's going to be great for restoring some hip extension on that down leg, and also some trunk rotation and moving through the obliques here. So if I've got someone that really needs to come out of a anterior orientation, they need to start to create some reciprocal action between sides of the pelvis, I'm probably going to choose something like this. In fact, if I'm being totally honest, I give this to a lot of people. I think it's really, really effective when done correctly. Okay, so that was sort of the ground-based, boring stuff out of the way there. But I think that's an important step to have. If we don't appreciate the ability to get that sagittal plane competency, then all this other stuff is so much less likely to be effective. So please appreciate the importance of that step. But after that, I like to go after external rotation measures. But the beautiful thing, like I said earlier, is that we're already going to have improved some of those. But if I still want to be able to create that external rotation bias, and I want to get some more of those measures back, like hip flexion, squat, toe touch, things like that, I would start to think about positions like this. I wanted to hit this slide really quick because you're going to see a lot of staggered stance positions. And this is why we're choosing the loading schemes that we are. If we've got a contralateral load, that would be this first image right here on the left. That would mean that we're able to create a counterbalance and shift more into that lead side leg. That would be my right leg in this instance. So I'm gonna feel more heel and midfoot naturally just by nature of being in this position. I don't have to coach anything. I don't have to say anything. I'm holding that weight in front of the leg, which is creating a turn from my trunk. You can see how that's happening a little bit into that leg. So here, I'm going to be biasing a little bit more of a negative to vertical tibial angle, which is representative of that earlier stance position, right? The earlier phases of gait, when we're going from external to internal rotation back out of it again. If I had an ipsilateral load, this would push me naturally onto my forefoot. So I'm going to get the front half of my foot to be more engaged here, but obviously my whole foot is still flat. This is going to bias me towards internal rotation on the descension, but I have to push out of that. I have to create a bigger strategy to drive out of that in order for me to be able to stand up straight and not be pulled off to the side. Let me visualize that for you guys so that you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. Okay. So if I've got this contralateral load right here, then I'm better able to bring this hip back. And then you'll see that I'm starting in this negative tibial angle. As I go down, it's more vertical, and then I come back out of that again. If I had more of an ipsilateral load, I'm starting in more of a vertical tibial angle. And then when I go down, it's more positive. So that's more of that pushing action that we're going for there. So that's why you're going to see these different loading constraints. Here's just a representation of how these things can affect that. This was off of a recent Instagram post I made. Notice how when I'm going for this heel strike mid stance, I've got the contralateral load. For the push off, I've got the ipsilateral load. Shin angle helps dictate kind of what you're biasing. Okay. So in order to restore external rotation, we want to have more heel reference and early stance bias. So we're looking for that negative tibial angle, at least to begin the exercise. More squat-like positions, because squats naturally bias more external rotation. And the key muscles we want to be aware of are the glute max, hamstrings, hip abductors. But like I mentioned, we need to be able to first posteriorly rotate this pelvis. If we can't do that, we're not going to have a whole lot of success being able to control these staggered stance positions if we don't have our orientation under control first. This is back, and we won't spend much time on this because this is a great ground-based starting activity. But if you wanted to bias a little bit more of that heel strike sort of position right there, notice how, and this is a okay, so I got this negative tibial angle right here, right? Contralateral load. As I go down, you might say, isn't that a forward shin angle? I would say no, because if you look at it relative to my elevated foot, it's a vertical tibial angle. That is really just me moving from negative to vertical. Relative to my foot, it is perfectly straight. And again, you guys will have all of these videos. I would not load this super heavy. This is a introductory exercise in a split stance position to bias some external rotation. If your goal is hypertrophy or strength, this is not your play, but it can be a very good warm-up. To progress that, this is one of my favorite activities for really getting deep into hip flexion and getting a deeper squat. So this requires a little bit of setup and a little bit of intricacy, but notice how I'm biasing the deepest, most bottommost positions of a squat here. So this is the deepest level of hip flexion before I had turf in my gym. And I'm creating a natural turn of my pelvis away from the stance side leg. What does that do? That ultimately just biases me towards more of a externally rotated position of the pelvis on the front leg. You can also do this without the weight. If you don't want to use the weight, that's fine. In fact, some people benefit from just feeling this out on their own first and holding on to something. But this is a great activity for really creating ER on that lead leg. Hinges are naturally more internally rotation dominant, but I wanted to touch on them because you can bias it slightly more towards external rotation. And the way you would do that is elevate the heel a little bit more. Again, relative to my foot right there, I am in more external rotation and a sort of negative to vertical shin angle. This can be helpful. Ipsilateral load helps me drive back out of that into external rotation. But again, if you have someone that doesn't hinge very well, again, I'm biased towards internal rotation, so I can hinge all day, every day. But if you have someone that doesn't hinge well, they're going to really struggle to use a rear heel elevated position. But if you wanted to incorporate this in someone's program, let's say you got someone, you just want to push them a little bit into ER and get a little bit more out of it while still loading a hinge, this could be a great way to do it. It also gives them a really good reference for their heel, a really good one. So if you have someone that can't keep their heel flat, it could be a good way to do it. If you wanted to get more into the concentric external rotation, because if we're thinking about it in terms of gait, heel strike is very much an eccentric phase of gait. We're trying to slow our body down with external rotation. We're trying to go here, slow this side down so the other side can come forward and then push off, right? So if we wanted to train more of that propulsive concentric external rotation, then a rear foot elevated split squat is a really good way to do that. You're going to get more propulsive activity here with an ipsilateral load. You're going to be driving even more of that. Look at that forward shin angle, driving out of that position right there. So here I'm relatively, if we're thinking about the sort of the arc model, then we're getting more IR here. And then we're going to need to push out of it with our glutes, hip abductors to get back into external rotation. And then if you want to get really deep, I like pistol squats a lot. I know that some people are divided on this subject, but I really like pistol squats because you can really control, especially supported. You can get really deep into hip flexion and control it. It's also the last progression for a reason. It's very challenging. But ideally, you'd be able to slowly remove references. But I love this for getting people to get control over the deepest portions of that hip flexion. So that was a lot of unilateral staggered stance positions because that's how you create the dissociation between the sides of the pelvis. That's why we went after the orientation first. And these are all engaging activities. You can still pick something like a Bulgarian split squat like we talked about. You can still load up something like this and be totally fine. You can even load this up to a certain extent. But these are all positions that are much more engaging for people than laying on the ground and breathing and doing all that for 15 minutes. There's other ways to accomplish what we're looking for. Internal rotation is usually the last step or the second, depending on how you're looking at the second or third step, because I like to give people a place to internally rotate too. Imagine this. Imagine that you were extended, or you're like me, you're biased towards internal rotation because I'm mutated like this. If I try to jam more internal rotation on a system that's already extended and internally rotated, I'm probably not going to have that much success. Because if you're already somewhere, whether that's genuine or compensatory internal rotation, usually it's hard to get more unless you can start from a place of relative external rotation. So again, we went after orientation first, so we can bring ourselves back. We can gain some of this back, and now we can move towards internal rotation and all that fun stuff and mutation. This is a general guideline. It is not a hard and fast rule. It's just what I've found the most success with. The key principles here are around 90 degrees of hip flexion, if we're thinking about the arc of the lower body and pelvis and hip flexion. Foot pronation is going to lead to a mid-stance bias and more internal rotation. The muscles that help create internal rotation at 90 degrees of hip flexion, the adductors, glute med, and obliques all pick up leverage concentrically. They can shorten to create that internal rotation. But we want to make sure we look out for is the Tfl muscle cramping, because a lot of people have a really weak glute med. This muscle right here, this glute med back here, can be really weak. So the muscle right next to it, that Tfl, which feels like a band running down a little bit more, it's more of a pressure point for a lot of people. This muscle can take over for a lack of function back there. So we want to make sure that that Tfl is not cramping up. People will probably tell you if it is because it doesn't feel very good. But the Tfl is leveraged to create compensatory internal rotation when there is not a lot of genuine IR happening. A nice sort of ab exercise and also a modification to the traditional Copenhagen Plank would be the 90-90 Copenhagen Plank, because now you're creating internal rotation of this top side leg and you're getting the glute med and adductor to work together. You're also getting some bottom side oblique. And this is, you can see Kyle's face, this is not easy. This is actually much harder than it looks. But I'm a fan of things that have a foot reference, something that's going to give the foot an association of the midfoot on the ground, and also some sort of load constraint to allow us to create that pronation at the foot. So you don't need to have your heels elevated here, but if you did, that'll help you stay a little bit more stacked. If you look at me from the side, this is a tempo. So I'm trying to allow those knees to come forward. I'm dropping straight down, light tap, boom, hovering right here around 90 degrees of hip flexion. And then I'm going to inhale, exhale, back up. In this position, the roller is helping create a little bit more of that mutation bias. It's creating a little bit more of this. And that is why we're not squeezing it, we're just passively holding it there. This can be a really good way to get someone straight leg raise to improve. Just by doing something like this in their prep, and then they're good. Or just for a beginner, I use this as a beginner squat progression for a lot of people that need to improve their straight leg raise and just don't know how to squat very well in the first place, because you're just constraining them into a good position. The hip shift squat is sort of a dynamic body weight unilateral progression. And I thought about incorporating this or not, but it's just such an effective exercise for the right person that I had to throw it in here. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get a ton of internal rotation on this back leg. This is a burner. And this is really good for people that have a right hip shift in a squat. This is really good for people that really lack dynamic internal rotation. And I know that this looks funky, but what you're really doing here is you're maximally opening up the pelvis on that side. So because you're in a staggered stance, you're already starting here. Let's say this is the back leg side right here. As you go deeper and deeper into that, you're creating this big old turn into that side, which is going to assist us in decompressing this area right here. Straight leg raises fly up after that. Internal rotation measures improve a lot. This one is also a little bit tricky to do. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message. But if we want to get a little bit more loaded, this is a position you could load all day, every day. A split stance deadlift, you can use a slight rear, if you have a wedge, it's definitely better, but you could use, for the purposes of demonstration right here, a little 2.5, 5-pound plate. And what you're trying to think about doing in this position is you're trying to think about pushing the front knee forward while staying heavy on the back heel. You could do this with a bilateral load if you really wanted to. I load this up heavy all the time. And you can do this with a trap bar even. I probably wouldn't elevate the toes if I'm using a trap bar, but you could progress to that. The reason why we're trying to elevate the toes and the reason why we're trying to push the other knee forward is same thing as in the hip shift squat activity. We're doing this. So as I get deeper and deeper into that hinge, I'm creating more and more of that turn, like so. And what the toe elevation is doing one of two things. It's helping me push my hips back. One second. It's helping me push my hips back and shifting better. So what I'm trying to do here is keep this knee going forward as I go down here. That toe elevation is also helping create a pronation strategy at my foot. But what we don't want to do is this. If this knee comes back, we lost that IR. So having the intention of this leg to go forward is good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is going forward. It's the intention that matters. So this is what a full rep looks like. Boom, and I got a big old stretch in this hip right here, which is good. Let's see, is there anything else on that I wanted to hit? I don't think so. Oh, you could also do a contralateral load if you wanted to facilitate more of a shift in that back hip. So I like to start people with the ipsilateral load just because it's easier to hinge back in here. People that can't hinge very well would struggle with a contralateral load, but if you wanted to, that's even more of a turn back there. Okay, let's keep it going. This position can sometimes be even better for people. Aside from the one we just talked about, this one can actually be even more effective. And it just depends, like how much can they actually shift back into that hip. But notice how I'm trying to keep my knee in line with my toes, in line with that back hip. What people will do too often is they'll spin out of their hip. Let's see if there's an example of that. I'll just show you guys. People will not get their glute to activate. They won't get their glute to be leveraged, and they won't be able to create that internal rotation if they spin out of it like this. And then they do one of these. We got to be able to line up the knee with the toe with the hip. So from the back, it looks like that right there. And then the contralateral load, shifting me back over to the side. And then that's going to help improve that concentric orientation of the adductor, glute med, all that fun stuff. You could also do a hip shift in a front foot elevated position. Why? Because that's going to bias deeper levels of hip flexion. And what he's doing here with the contralateral load is shifting that front hip back. That's going to give him more concentric leverage of that adductor, glute med, and oblique on that side. So what he's trying to think about doing is pulling the front knee back, pushing the back knee forward, keeping his pelvis level. Because what that is doing is that's doing this. If this is my stance leg, this is the forward leg right here. Boom. And then if you're creating a turn, you're getting even more of that. Another sort of higher level progression to that would be a banded single leg step down. I like these. And you don't even have to use the band. I just use the band to really cook the glute med. But what this is really focusing on is deeper levels of hip flexion. There's a common theme here I hope you guys are seeing, but also being able to control that descent into internal rotation. And that band constraint is allowing me to get that glute med to work with the adductor. And you don't have to use it, but I found it's quite helpful. It could just be a little bit of a pain to set up. Now, here's the most important part of the whole presentation. And this is why I really believe in what I do. And I believe in this process, because If you choose a technique, I don't care what it is, it could be one of these ground-based drills, it can be one of these weighted activities. To a certain extent, when you start using a ton of weight, you're going to have to kick on more musculature, you're going to use different strategies. But if you're just using things as like my goal is to improve movement and these tests and the way this person feels, then you should be able to do a technique or an exercise and immediately test after that set and see an improvement. If you didn't, there's only two choices. There's only two options. Either you didn't pick the right exercise or you didn't coach it well enough. Those are the only two options. And so that humbles us as coaches, because that means that we need to get better in our decision-making process or coaching cueing. But that's also the amazing thing, is that these things aren't going to lie to you. These tests, if you do these tests right, they're not going to lie to you. So you can go to sleep soundly at night when you give your clients an exercise that improves their assessment, because you know that this person is going to end up improving their movement and very, very likely feeling better. I can count on one hand the amount of people that pass all the tests genuinely and still have issues going on. Usually they're psychological or cranial, or there's something with their vision going on. But for the overwhelming majority of people, if they pass these tests and they do it well without compensation, they're going to be feeling pretty good. And it's all relative, right? Some people will never need to be able to get to 120 degrees of hip flexion. If you're a power lifter, you're probably never going to be able to do that. But if you can get to 105, 110, you're probably in a pretty good spot. So use your common sense with that. It'll get easier with more reps that you take and use with your clients or yourself. So you might be asking now, what if you have a mixed assessment result? What if there's asymmetrical considerations? What about the upper body? And what if I need more help and examples? Today, you guys are in luck. I'm going to re-extend the early bird price for exactly 24 hours from the end of this presentation. It's going to expire at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time tomorrow, and you can save $150, which is pretty good, because that's taking the price from $225 down to $175 a month. I will be sending out a link in an email, but also you can go to my website right now. And right after this is over, I'm going to knock the price down. You can sign up then. And this is going to be a lot more than what we covered in this presentation. I do genuinely feel like I have given you guys a lot of tools, a lot of my, frankly, best information, because I want you guys to get better. But if you want more help, more guidance, more examples, a ton more exercises, and more of a specifically laid out model, then this is probably for you. The first week, just to give you an outline of what it is, we go into basic principles and biomechanical introduction. Then we go into a full deep dive on gait, way more than we did today. We get into the upper body. We get into genetic biases. We talk about the infrasternal angles. We talk about the PRI left AIC pattern. We get into all that fun stuff. And then we're going to go way deeper into an assessment protocol, and then understand how compensations can predictably occur based on these genetic biases and asymmetry. We're humans, we're different, but we're not that different. So there are predictable compensations that happen, and then you can cross-reference them with the assessments we learned the week before, and we can know where to plug and play someone. Finally, the last couple of weeks we talk about, here are some ground-based warm-up activities getting progressively more challenging, kind of like we did today. I mixed both week 7 and 8 into today, but we get so many more examples. There'll be over 100 exercises in the exercise library by the time you guys get it. And then we get into plyometrics and athletic development. How do we use these sort of principles to help make us better exercise selection decisions within plyos, within sprint training, within multi-directional speed, things like that. Then finally, we finish off with some energy system development, and that, yes, biomechanics do actually play into this. And I think you guys will be surprised how. Finishing with example case studies, because it's a lot of information, right? So I want to give you guys specifically laid out examples of clients I've used in the past, every step I took with them to get to where they are, feeling good, healthy, doing their thing, making improvements within their performance and movement. And then finally, I give you guys an example case study, or you can use one of your clients. And then that is the final project, along with a short 25 to 30 question test to get your certificate of completion. Thank you guys for attending this. I hope it was helpful. I'm here to answer any questions that you have. If you guys want to go through an exercise, feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to coach you through it. If you guys want to go through an assessment, feel free. And then let me know. I'd be happy to coach you guys through whatever you want at this point. I'll be sticking around until all the questions are answered. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate it. All right, I'm going to start way at the top here. We got a lot. Yeah, my webinars are all on YouTube. Would you elevate the heel in a split squat to get plantar flexion of the calcaneus, or is it to bias more ER? So you are going to be getting more, let me see if I can find my wedge. Okay. So with this, if I elevate my heel right here, then I'm going to be biasing more of this negative tibia angle. Notice how the deeper I get into a tibia angle, the more my foot pronates. And then beyond that, I'm going to resupinate. But if I can start in a negative tibia angle, I'm going to be getting relatively more supination and external rotation of the tibia. Heel elevation is also massive. You guys have any clients, or you have any athletes or yourself, you overpronate your foot, you just collapse down inwards? You can help avoid that by elevating your heel, because you're not going to have the opportunity to bring that foot really far forward to collapse down into. You're going to be transitioning from here to here. You can regain the access to begin to pronate properly because you're not being pushed so far forward all the time. Let's say somebody is biased towards one orientation. Let's just say IR. Does that mean they exhibit ER as a compensatory strategy? So like in the hold the squat, they tend to A-B duct their knees. Yeah, that can be, it really, like, I would need to see what their assessment looks like, but generally speaking, the human body is going to take the path of least resistance to find what it doesn't have. So if I, for example, and we talk about this in the compensations week, if I'm really extended right here and I'm biased towards internal rotation, or if I'm just nutated like so, how am I going to pick up external rotation? Well, I could create a concentric strategy of this right here. These lower glutes, deep external rotators of my pelvis can grip to create this happening, but also push my pelvis forward in space, which is going to do this. That's what a lot of people that are very strong, that have a lot more femoral external than internal rotation, that's usually partially what's going on there. For someone that struggles with a hinge, a heel elevation would not be beneficial. I would probably not, yeah. Because what a hinge does is it biases a little bit more external rotation. If you wanted to get them to hinge better, I'd probably elevate their toe instead. Can you do that hip shift squat with a TRX? I think it'd be kind of hard to do that because it's sort of more of like a hinge hybrid with a squat, because what you're really trying to do is, I find it's helpful to hold on to something because you're really trying to get some flexion back and then get deep. It's sort of like the staggered stance deadlift variation. And then you're trying to it's like a hinge mixed with a squat, but ultimately you're trying to create a big shift over to that side. I'm sure there's a way you could figure it out on the TRX. I've just never needed to do that. So if you have a right hip shift, you'll do the left hip shift test that you showed. Usually, yes, but there's usually more that needs to go into that. Usually people that are stuck in their right side need to push out of their right side too. They need to learn how to go from here, stuck over on their right side, to push out of it, right? They need to be able to push, or sorry. Yeah, this is what I've had that backwards. You push out of your right side like that. And usually you need a glute to do that. Usually you need more ER on that side to do that. What to do for people that can't get out of lumbar flexion on a deadlift? They need to learn how to nutate. They need to learn how to create IR effectively. So elevating the toes can be a really good thing. Doing some sort of prep activity with a ball between the knees and going into like the concentric portion of a deadlift. For example, you could, let's just say I have the heel elevation or the toe elevation underneath each. You could just elevate the toes and then that'll shoot their hips back naturally for them. Or what you could do is keep some sort of object in between their knees, and you could even, if you want to add more constraints right here, and then they're really gonna be effective at creating that internal rotation to the relative extent that they can. Thank you, guys. I appreciate all the kind words. If you're in a forward pelvic orientation, once you have improved, do you want to target more IR or ER? I laid it out in this presentation very specifically because of that reason, because of what I talked about. If you're extended like a lot of people are, then by bringing this orientation back, you're going to pick up leverage for ER. But if you still need to improve more, you still need to regain some counter nutation mechanics because your assessments show that that's what you need. Then I would still go after ER because then you have somewhere to internally rotate to, instead of trying to jam more internal rotation on a system that's already extended. So I would probably want to address, someone's going to ask, and it would be a very fair question, what if you are stuck here, stuck in this orientation where you have like a sort of sway back, or you have just a flat back and you have a ton of external rotation, no internal rotation? Well, then those people are probably going to pass hip flexion, squat, toe touch, and they're also probably going to have good ER measures all across the board. So at that point, why would we want to work on it? We would just go into internal rotation from there. But if they don't pass those tests genuinely, then we know we have some work to do. Thanks, Borba. If you have an adductor strain up to the pubic bone, would that result in a limited hip IR? I would imagine it does, but you could have a groin strain for one of two reasons. Primarily, if you've got an adductor here that is stretched out because you got lateral pelvic orientation or something like that, then this muscle is too eccentrically elongated, the slack's taken out of it. So if you try to produce a lot of concentric force with that, or you have more eccentric stress, that can result in that groin strain. Same thing if you had a shortened groin, the same concepts can apply because the length tension relationship of that muscle is now compromised. So you probably do have limited IR in some way, shape, or form with that. And ultimately, I would probably think about just where's your orientation of your pelvis? Can you control flexion and extension in the first place? If you can't, I would start there. Do you suggest working towards, I already read that one. When you have someone, when you have someone do those single leg movements to recapture motion, do you have them do the exercise on both sides? If not, how would you program which side to pick? Usually I will, but there are cases when someone has a lateral pelvic orientation or a very asymmetrical pelvic orientation. In that case, why would we do bilateral activities? Why would we do anything that is, symmetrical in nature for the most part? Because an asymmetrical body requires an asymmetrical approach. So at that point, I would probably have them do certain things on one side. And we address that in the compensations and progression model week. And there's several different orientations that can occur. There's 3 primary ones, and we discuss those. I'm new to all this. How do you incorporate and program these exercises? Is your course appropriate for someone with no biomechanics experience? I have a beginner one if you want to look at that before going into the main one. I would check that out. It's 4 weeks, give you a good overview. But I would program these types of exercises within prep or in their accessory block. Usually programs have prep, warm up, whatever. Then they have their main lift. Let's say it's like a squat day. They got their primary squat. They got their secondary squat. Then in the third block, you would probably want to incorporate more of these positions, more of your split squats, staggered stance deadlifts, things like that. And you can still push the weight on them. For sure you could. Or you can incorporate these principles into more of a bilateral symmetrical stance fashion. So for example, you have someone that sucks at deadlifting, elevate their toes on that hinge. Or you have someone that sucks at squatting, elevate their heels and use an anterior load to help them stay more upright. Another example would be if you want them to lift a bunch of weight in a single leg position, do a staggered stance trap bar deadlift and then have them get after it. That would be better for most people because you're creating a little bit of that relative motion. Thank you, Brandon. What if you get results on your post test, but shortly after they go back to their original measures? They probably need to do more of it. They probably need consistency, and they need to probably be coached in what they're doing in their lifestyle. So for example, are they doing these drills and then sitting for 8 hours? It's probably going to result in them reverting back to how they got there. Are they not moving enough? Are they standing in an awkward position? Are they leaning on one hip more than the other all the time? That's why it's important to know what they're doing outside of the gym as well. I'm getting much more uncomfortable hinging than squatting, but when I elevate my heels and hinge, it feels so much better and a ton more hamstring. What might that mean? I think elevating the heel, like I kind of touched on earlier, it can, if you have competency in hinging, which it sounds like you probably do, you know how to hinge. That can give you and your brain a reference to get back on your heel, to create a little bit more of that, like, quote unquote, early stance bias, which will in turn allow you to get back and find your heels better. So you're not coming onto your toes as much, which is counterintuitive because you're elevating the heel and it looks like your shin is going forward, but it's really just going vertical for a lot of the time. Can you have people who have their weight in their toes with a flat lumbar spine, but exaggerated thoracic and cervical curves? That's probably sway back posture. That's probably someone who was forward on both sides, and then they're like, oh crap, how am I going to prevent myself from falling too far forward? They're going to butt grip, roll under like this, and then their pelvis kind of gets pushed under, but you can still have those wonky spine curves as a result of that. Those people usually have a lot of compensations built up. Can you illustrate how does a 90-90 Copenhagen plank get IR of the hip? Yes, I can. So if I'm at 90 degrees of hip flexion, what is that bias? Internal rotation and nutation. Because I am creating a lot of force with my adductor right here, I'm going to create this right here even more. So you're going to be from an upright position. If this is the leg that's working, I'm creating that turn there to here. But because I'm 90-90 on both legs, I'm getting it throughout my whole, I'm getting it systemically, but more so on that working side leg. Why do you suggest not loading up heavy on the front foot elevated squat, split squat? Because it's there to serve as sort of like a biomechanical outcome. I've just found when people have a heavy weight and like a contralateral load with a front foot elevate or like a front heel elevate, not necessarily front foot elevate. That's a different story because the whole foot can stay flat. There's a better ability to produce force through that foot because it's flat and it's not tilted. I would probably load up the FFE instead of the front heel elevated if my goal was to drive output, but still bring them back a little bit. Why do people generally have limited straight leg raise and IR on the left hip and limited IR on the right shoulder? That's because in the normal asymmetrical presentation of the human body, we are biased towards internal rotation on our right side, external rotation on our left. So IR measures are worse on the left, generally speaking, better on the right. And in the upper body, in order for us to even ourselves out, because our pelvis is going right, if we're doing this, we have to counter rotate here so that not everything is going right. And then this right shoulder gets pulled forward. That's why internal rotation becomes limited on the right. All right. Is a right hip more common? Yes, because of that asymmetry of the pelvis that we were talking about. It's more common because that asymmetrical pelvic orientation that we go into much detail on in week 4 of the program. And when you have a left hip shift in a squat, then that's usually because the left hip, if we're here, that's normal where a lot of people are, but some people can compensate, come up and over the top with the left. And then that's when you would see a left hip shift because then you're just dropping down to the left. What is your opinion on lower body isolation exercises like machine seated leg curls and leg extensions? I think they're fine if your goal is for hypertrophy. I think you can incorporate all that stuff. I think it's like, what are you trying to accomplish, I guess? I don't think there's like I mean, it's like what part of lower body health too. I think I understand what you're saying as it relates to biomechanical outcomes, but I would not use one of those things to change what I'm looking for because they're an open chain exercise, right? The foot is not fixated to anything. You're not creating a reference to how the body is going to move. It's harder. The pelvis is more fixated because when we move and when we run and when we walk, the pelvis is moving over the femur, and that it's just this occurring. Can you quickly tell the compensations in the sway back? They're going to have very limited straight leg raise, less than 45 degrees on both sides. They're going to have very limited internal rotation. Their hip flexion is probably going to be, well, their hip flexion could be better than you think because they're starting really compressed here, so they can just sort of roll their pelvis underneath themselves as they bring that leg back. You're also going to see very, very limited shoulder flexion in these people. And their squat's going to be miserable. It's going to be like 70, 80 degrees. And their toe touch, either they're going to palm the floor or they're not going to get to usually even mid-shin. How is it possible to have an adductor strain if that person is already in hip IR? Let's say that you've got this asymmetrical pelvis right here. If this creates concentric leverage of the adductor and it pulls the leg in like this. So this right adductor tends to be a little bit tighter than the left. But what if you had a big eccentric stress on that adductor? What if you had a big concentric stress on that adductor? How is that muscle going to contract more? Let's say you're in a squat and you really need to create internal rotation through your adductors. If that muscle is already chronically shortened, trying to get it to shorten more could create a strain because it's not leveraged well enough to create that contraction. Or let's say that you're playing basketball or whatever, and you try to push off this leg, big eccentric stress, ooh, groin strain right there. That's usually how those things happen. Thanks, Pedro. Anything else? I'll be here as long as you guys have questions. Nothing? Going once? Confused about pelvic tilt. Can you expand upon that question there, Harrison?
Yeah, absolutely. Is it okay if I audio in?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so with that, like, it seems like there's the reciprocal motion of the, or the, I guess, relative motion of the pelvic moving on the, or the innominates moving on the sacrum and vice versa. So let's say if we're doing like a posterior pelvic tilt, is that referring to more specifically counternutation of the sacrum and IR of the innominates?
It would be this right here.
Okay.
It would be ER of the innominates.
Okay.
Like that. Gotcha. Yeah.
So
but you're also needing to control the orientation of the pelvis as a whole as you do that.
So everything's kind of moving in that direction. It's not really relative motion anymore. Is that right?
Yes and no. Like just by nature of getting the sacrum to tip back, you are going to have the pelvis move back. But this is sagittal plane competency as a whole, which is usually the first step for people. But you can have a situation like in a squat where, you know, let's say you are stuck in counternutation, you have like that flat back and you need to find internal rotation at the sticking point of a squat. You can just dump your pelvis forward as a whole unit to create that internal rotation. You can overly extend.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Sorry, my mouth is incredibly dry. How would you start addressing pronation in the left foot? Is the foot trying to find IR that the hip doesn't have? Yeah, usually the left foot tends to be more pronated than the right, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing. Usually an overly pronated foot is trying to find a strategy to create internal rotation at a hip. That is usually it. So if we're thinking about where the left hip is in space, it's forward right there, then we should probably think about bringing that left hip back first. Because we can bring that left hip back first by addressing its orientation, then we're going to take this foot from being forward and collapsed back to this right here. And that's usually a good first step. How would you explain the PRI squat test when they explain it as you have to keep the posterior outlets open to go into the deepest position possible? So what you're saying right there, Ian, is that they're saying you got to be here. I think it's relative. Right? So I think everyone has a different way of looking at it, but in order to get deep into a squat, you have to begin to recounternutate. It's not like you're going to start here and then you're going to get deep, and you're going to be here. And then you're suddenly going to like spring all the way back to here, right? It's a relative motion. So these outlets probably are relatively open, but you need to begin to move back at the deepest portion. By muscle asymmetrical activation, is there a chance that ipsilateral, the pelvic is in ER and femur in IR? If so, how do you assess it? Christopher, if I'm being honest, I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. It depends what side is which side is ipsilateral, what side is contralateral there. So let me know in the chat and I'll get back to you on that. Can you discuss potential compensations for rotational athletes? If they always rotate one way, yeah, you can certainly see that. Honestly, athletes, especially good ones that are rotational athletes, like baseball players, a lot of them are really, really good compensators. And they usually have an orientation of some sorts. I've worked with quite a few like high-level pitchers, and a lot of them, like let's say they need to be able to turn to the right, or let's say, you know, I'm a righty, so I need to be able to turn to the left, and I can't turn to the left because we can't do that as effectively. What a lot of people do is they'll create a strategy within an orientation of their pelvis, however it may be, in order to accomplish that. So usually these people, at least in my experience, have pretty big deficits in the upper body measurements, like internal rotation. They're throwing arm shoulder. They usually have very limited shoulder flexion. And in terms of their trunk rotation, it usually tends to be pretty good to that side. But again, they're not going to be too good going the other way, and their loading of that hip is often not great. So again, got to find IR in some way, got to get that relative motion back. But I would also say that if you are a baseball pitcher or if you are a rotational athlete, you will always have an asymmetrical test result. And I think that's totally acceptable. It's just how much of it do we want? Jack, I am not the person to ask that question for. I know what you mean, but I'm a trainer and a strength coach, not like someone that's really deep in the PRI stuff like that. Just to clarify, when you are talking about IR, are you referring to the femur or the pelvic orientation? Both. Usually the pelvis more so, but then the femur follows. Yeah, go ahead, Christopher.
Okay, sorry. What I meant is that, let's say by the iliac muscles, the pelvis goes into internal rotation, right? And okay, let's say that at the same time, let's say on the left side, and at the same time, the external rotators of the hip are, let's say, tight. So that's what I meant by asymmetrical activation. Like, you know, the iliac goes inside and the external rotators are outside. So is there a chance that there's an activation in both at the same time? And if so, how do you assess it?
I think that would be similar to someone that, like, if you got one side that's in IR and they need to like find ER, they might tighten this up. That means that they're probably going to do something similar to the sway back, right? Where that pull is going to pull that pelvis down and under. And that's going to push the femur out into ER, because there's always like a consequence of this happening. It's not like you can be in IR and ER at the same time. Usually, like, we're trying to find the path of least resistance to find what we don't have, but we end up being limited in everything as a result of that. So it's going to be like, yeah, let's say we're here. And then, oh, I like, for whatever reason, maybe I need to bring this hip forward and be able to propel off of it. By doing that, that's going to start opening up this other side. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I've heard the term always start by giving them ERs. It's always the case if it's a narrow with primary compensations. Yeah, see, the thing is, Harrison, is that when we look at how we discussed this today and took everyone through the steps, the first is orientation, and we did all these different, like, hey, now you might want to think about ER. This is usually what works for most people, but if they already passed the test genuinely, then you don't need to give them more ER. You know, if they're narrow with primary compensations, they pass all the tests, then just give them IR, and then you're good to go. You guys got anything else? Going once, going twice. Thank you guys for sticking around to the end. I will be sending out that email with the exercise list and the link to the website right after this. Thank you guys for your time. Have a good week.